Hi, welcome to this video on Lean and Six Sigma for services and information technology. My name is Fabrizio, I'm a Master Black Belt, and today I would like to talk to you about the application of Lean and Six Sigma beyond the world of manufacturing, applications to services and information technology. And I would like to show you how, with the necessary adaptation, Lean and Six Sigma provide us with a very effective framework for what we call experimental process improvement. Two fundamental questions I would like to try and answer with this presentation. Number one, why? Why do we need to bother with Lean and Six Sigma if we work in services and information technology? And number two, if we believe these methods can bring value to services organizations, well, just how do we do it? How do we implement these tools and techniques in an environment so different from the world of industry and manufacturing, where these methods were originally developed? And finally, I've added my contact details for those of you who want to follow up after this presentation and perhaps share your experience on process improvement. I do encourage you to look me up on LinkedIn. On to question number one. Why do we need to concern ourselves with something like Lean and Six Sigma if we work in banking, insurance, IT and software, telco or healthcare? The first thing to notice is that every modern service organization faces a number of process performance challenges. The sheer number of actors involved and the interfaces with the processes of our customers and our suppliers means we have to manage increasingly complex processes. For some organizations, these processes are supporting operations that stretch across the entire planet with new challenges on a global scale. Technological change and innovation is constantly accelerating, as well as our customer needs and expectations. These two change quite dramatically and quite frequently. So we need our processes to keep up with all these changes that happen outside the organization, as well as changes that happen within the organization and the pressure coming from competition. So in short, every modern service organization faces process performance challenges. The question now is, how do we respond to these challenges as an organization? And we only have three choices really. Number one, we may choose not to improve at all, which might work for a little while, but sooner or later our customers will realize that the quality of the service is not in line with their expectations. They will go somewhere else, and this will have a negative impact on our bottom line. So clearly not a very good strategy. We may choose to improve as a reaction to specific quality problems, but this approach very often leads to a culture of firefighting. And for organizations that are constantly in firefighting mode, the cost of defects and waste will do nothing but increase. Or we may choose to embed a culture of continuous improvement and try to learn as an organization how to respond effectively to these process challenges. And if we decide to go for continuous improvement, we have some additional decisions to make. In particular, we have to choose the model that we're going to follow to guide our continuous improvement effort. And there are several frameworks, several models out there supporting continuous improvement. So how do we choose the right model for our organization? Well, when you try and classify all these models, you realize that we are dealing with two big philosophies, two families of approaches to continuous improvement. On one hand, we have best practices for service management like ITIL, best practices for project management like PMP or Prince2, best practices for software product development. So you see, best practices talk about different things. They talk about the project, they talk about the product, they talk about the service, but they have something in common. A best practice is essentially a catalog of solutions. Solutions based on the experience and the good results of a number of organizations, but the underlying philosophy of a best practice sounds a bit like it worked for other organizations elsewhere, so follow this approach, follow this best practice, and you will see the results. Believe me, that's why we call it improvement by the book. And whilst best practices are very important to help us shape a vision for improvement, they tend to be very high level and descriptive. More and more organizations are beginning to invest in what we call experimental or problem-driven approaches. Now here, the approach is that we do not accept a predefined solution, not until we understand the true nature of the problem and investigate to the level of the root causes. So you see, these are two very different philosophies driving continuous improvement. One is more solution-driven, the other one is problem-driven. But what does it really mean in practice to drive process improvement as a problem-solving exercise? Well, first we need to understand what is a process. And in layman's terms, we can think of a process as a system of activities designed to transform input into output. Now, input factors include material, people, information, energy, forms, procedures, skills, and knowledge, anything that we consume as part of the process in order to deliver an output. And the output is typically in the form of a product or a service. Now, process problems usually emerge at the level of the output, which is natural because at this level you will find a user or a customer that receives the output, and they will tell us if the service is of bad quality, if it takes too long, if it comes too late, or if it costs too much. All these are output measures, measures that capture the symptoms of the problems. Now, even though we would like to make our customers happy, we would like to improve the output, we must realize that we have no direct control. The output, by definition, is a result, is an effect, is a consequence of a number of other variables. So we will make a clear distinction in our approach between controllable and uncontrollable variables. We are going to call these the Y's and the X's of our process. Problem-solving methods will help us to understand and represent our processes as a system of Y's and X's, a system of inputs and outputs. Now, our goal is to improve the output, but we realize we cannot change the output directly. The output is an effect, is a consequence, is where we're going to find the symptoms of the problem. So the attention will shift to the input factors, the X's, the parameters we can control, and we're going to use our knowledge of these parameters to change and improve the output. But in order to do so, we need to understand what is the relationship between the X's and the Y's. So we need to understand this transfer function. That's why we look at a sort of mathematical model to represent processes. And the key in any problem-solving approach is to use prioritization techniques, to use process analysis and data analysis techniques to help us identify and isolate the most important X's, those few critical X's that really explain the behavior of the Y. We call these critical few X's the root causes of the problem, and this is where we're going to introduce change and improvement. Now, even though we want to get to the root causes of the problems, our problem-solving life cycle will start with a stage where we seek consensus and agreement amongst the stakeholders on the symptoms of the problem. How do we measure this problem? What are the visible symptoms? And this step is going to be very important from a change management perspective when later we try and mobilize support for introducing change and improvement. So what are the typical symptoms that organizations will encounter when looking at their process problems? Well, it could range from finding an awful lot of non-value-add activities or waste in our processes, finding defects, and obviously the rework and the cost associated with these defects, having services that are delivered too late, projects that fail, or in any case do not deliver all the value that is expected from the stakeholders, being unable to respect targets and commitments, service level agreements, estimates and deadlines, making the wrong decisions, and probably the worst problem of them all, a systematic failure to learn from our mistakes. So these are the symptoms, these are the Y's. Naturally, from just observing the symptoms of our process problems, we want to move to the level of the X's. We want to find the root causes and fix those problems. So the question is, how do we do this effectively as an organization? What are the key ingredients to become effective at problem solving? Well, I believe there are some basic components to this. The first one is more of a mindset. We need to recognize that we don't have all the answers, and we should resist the temptation of jumping on a solution too quickly. In fact, we need to be open to learn and discover new things. These aspects of learning and discovery truly drive the entire problem-solving exercise. And if we want to learn and discover, well, the best way to do this is to ask the right questions. And Lean and Six Sigma tools are designed to help us do exactly this, ask the right questions. And finally, as I said, we want to have an effective approach as an organization. So problem solving is something we all do naturally, almost instinctively in our day-to-day life. We all solve problems at work, in our personal life. But if we want to do this effectively as an organization, we need a shared model. We need a common framework to help us in problem solving. This framework is at the heart of Lean Six Sigma. It's called the DMAKE model. It's a 5-step problem-solving life cycle that starts with a define phase, where we try and clearly define and get agreement on the symptoms of the problem. We then have a measure phase, where we baseline the current performance of our process. In the analyze phase, we use process and data analysis techniques to understand the root causes of the problem. And in the improve phase, we introduce change, pilot and experiment with those root causes to really try and demonstrate performance improvement. And then we'll think about sustaining this improvement with a control phase. And throughout these phases, Lean and Six Sigma provide the tools and the techniques to help us move from simply observing the symptoms, the whys, to then decomposing, measuring and analyzing our processes in terms of whys and X's. And as we do this, we gain a better understanding of our processes. And that is truly the essence of problem solving. It's an exercise in learning and knowledge acquisition. And there lies its true power. So to close on the question, why Lean Six Sigma for services? Well, because it provides organizations and individuals with a common framework, a shared model for solving process problems at the level of their root causes. And compared to other process improvement and problem-solving methods, there are some unique characteristics to Lean Six Sigma. First of all, the approach is very pragmatic. We focus on reducing defects, waste, cost of poor quality, so our projects are naturally built around the business case. The approach is experimental in nature. As we said, this means we don't accept predefined solutions if we don't understand the root causes of our problems first. And finally, it's a quantitative method. It means we try and use as much as possible facts, data and evidence to drive our decision making and rely less on opinions and gut feeling. Now, everything we've discussed up to this point applies to organizations in manufacturing, in services, and information technology alike. All these organizations can use an effective framework for solving process problems. And in terms of defects and waste, the services industry is probably performing much worse than manufacturing. Only in services, we're not very good at measuring that. So the question is, why is it that Lean and Six Sigma is still relatively new to the services business, very often perceived as just another management fad or a trend, and very quickly dismissed? Well, perhaps this skepticism is because most attempts to use the traditional model designed for manufacturing operations have failed when applied to services and information technology. So the question we'd like to answer now is how? How do we adapt Lean and Six Sigma tools to deal with services and not physical products? This is the topic for the second half of the presentation. Well, the case studies are there to prove the claim that Lean and Six Sigma have truly revolutionized the world of manufacturing. And besides the traditional quotes that you find in all the Lean Six Sigma books, it is true that today pretty much any manufacturing organization uses some form of Lean or Six Sigma. Now, things are very different outside the world of manufacturing. Over the years, I found myself in the position of trying to sell this idea, this concept of Lean Six Sigma applied to services and IT, and I've recorded a number of objections. Well, first of all, the fact that service processes do not seem to be good candidates for quantitative methods. We simply do not measure our processes like this. The predominant role of people in services, that's one of the key differences between manufacturing and services. And there's also proliferation of improvement models coming from within the services and IT industry. So services organizations today seem to be more concerned with innovation and agility than using statistical methods for process improvement. And finally, you hear accounts of failures with previous Lean Six Sigma initiatives. And this perception seems to be confirmed by some more authoritative sources. Lean and Six Sigma does not seem to work for services and information technology. Now, I beg to differ, and that's the whole point of this presentation. And I have seen organizations in finance, telecommunication, IT, software, and public services drive successful change using Lean and Six Sigma. But we have to get it right. The first thing to clarify is, what do we mean exactly by Six Sigma? You see, the methodology has evolved over the years from being just a way to measure and compare processes using the famous Sigma levels to providing a set of roles and responsibilities in the organization, the green belts, the black belts. In my opinion, the DMake is the most effective way of packaging a number of useful tools and techniques, and some organizations have been so successful with Six Sigma that they've chosen Six Sigma as their management strategy, their management philosophy. And most importantly, these methods today can be used as a framework for problem solving, change, and continuous improvement. This is what services and IT organizations can really benefit from. However, the frameworks need to be tailored to the types of processes we're trying to improve. There is an important aspect of evolution that we need to take into account. As the economy shifted from agriculture to industry to services and more recently to information technology, process improvement practitioners found themselves facing very different challenges when trying to improve their processes. If you look at the world of manufacturing, all manufacturing processes share some common characteristics. In general, the voice of the customer is clear. Customer requirements relate to measurable specifications for a product, so there is no ambiguity. The process is designed to produce always the same output for every customer, so it has to be highly repeatable, standardized, and our focus is minimizing variation. The other thing about manufacturing processes is that these processes are observable. You can sort of visualize the process by following the physical product that goes through the different stages of the process. That's why we call them product-driven. When we move to the world of services, the first thing we realize is that our voice of the customer is ambiguous. It may even relate to emotional requirements and very rarely takes the form of measurable specifications. The process is performed by people, and people themselves are the biggest source of variation, but we cannot deal with this type of variation as we would on a production line. The aspect of communication is key. In fact, these processes are not driven by a physical product, but rather by the exchange of information across the actors involved in the process. And finally, if we look at software and IT, organizations in this space very often have to deal with ill-defined or unknown requirements. The process is again a communication process, but this time is a particular type of communication process heavily supported by the use of models. Requirements documents, design documents, technical specifications, architecture models, test cases, all these artifacts are what we produce and we exchange in the process to make it more visible and to facilitate communication and understanding between the actors. Now, you can clearly see that the models developed for manufacturing simply are not a good fit for these very different processes. And even within the services space, we need to make some distinctions. The traditional Lean Six Sigma model is mostly used for what we call transactional or maintenance interactive processes. Think about financial transactions, payments or payroll processing, call center operations. These activities are so repetitive and standardized that the original focus on minimizing variation is still appropriate. Now, as we move towards services that require more interaction because every task is different, so we call them task interactive services, and these processes tend to be less repeatable. Imagine project management or requirements engineering or software development. So the focus here has to shift on communication defects, and the tools and the techniques we use for improving these processes are very different. There's a third group of services that we call personal interactive. These are more based on one-to-one interaction, so they're less relevant for what we do here. So if we are to use Lean and Six Sigma to improve information-driven processes, we need an integrated framework, and this will require some radical adaptation. The backbone of our model is still provided by Lean Six Sigma. As I mentioned, I personally find it the most effective way of packaging tools and techniques in a logical way. Lean Six Sigma itself relies on a solid foundation of measurement and statistics, but again, the type of studies that we will conduct in services are very different, more related to psychometrics measurement than hard data analysis, and we have very different challenges when it comes to measurement in the services business. We also need to integrate with other process improvement methods and project management practices. I will show you in a minute how this integration happens. And finally, we want to use Lean and Six Sigma to their full potential. That is a problem-solving methodology to help us manage change. And as new methods and practices emerge, Lean Six Sigma also will evolve. This is how the framework can progressively integrate and accommodate elements coming from agile, from design thinking, or probabilistic approaches. So these models is essentially evolutionary in nature and is not a static model. So far we have covered quite a lot of theory, and my apologies for that, but I hope it was helpful to clarify the main concepts behind the Lean Six Sigma for Services framework. Perhaps some practical examples at this point might help us to bring it all to life. I am not allowed to name names in this presentation, but I can tell you that I have coached a number of green belts and black belts, and I have seen some very successful projects, very often with a handsome return on investment, in particular for software houses. In this environment, we have used Lean Six Sigma to baseline the injection and the removal of software defects and to help us optimize the resources and the budget for verification activities. In the telecommunication business, Lean Six Sigma has been used to improve the order-to-cash process, identifying the root causes of a long cycle time and the drivers of possible revenue leakage. I've seen in banking, the IT department of a large financial group using Lean Six Sigma to improve their ability to deliver IT projects on time and with more accurate estimates and tracking of project progress. Other applications are in the area of HR processes, finance, logistics, field services, reporting, customer support, claims management. So I do invite anyone who's interested to get in touch with me, and I'll be very happy to share some more case studies. To close with this idea of an integrated framework, I'm not suggesting here that we should use Lean and Six Sigma to sort of encapsulate all other quality models. On the contrary, you should think of Lean and Six Sigma as a sort of a plug-in, an accelerator for all your investment in quality initiative. You see, most best practices for project management or service management deal with what we call the macro or even meta processes. So these models are high-level descriptive models that focus on the what. They contain a set of requirements for organizations to implement certain things. For example, these models might tell you that you need to measure your process, you need to manage your incidents and your defects, you need to introduce continuous improvement, but because of their very nature, these models do not provide us with the tools and the techniques to implement those requirements. So they're not concerned with the how. Lean and Six Sigma, problem solving in general, are focused on the how, the tools and techniques, so they naturally complement these higher level descriptive frameworks. And finally, because in Lean Six Sigma we systematically measure our processes and their performance, we can confirm if a particular best practice, if a particular macro model is really delivering results for the organization. So using Lean Six Sigma, we can also establish meaningful and useful feedback loop across the different levels of processes. On a very final note, most services organizations today are more concerned with finding systematic approaches to innovation, which may demote the entire Lean Six Sigma effort to trying and do a little bit better what we already do today, as opposed to design thinking and creative approaches where we are exploring the new. Now, this is again a misconception. All these methods for innovation, they rely on a form of problem solving, although a more creative version of it. But all these methods, with no exception, assume that we have a good enough understanding of the problem so that we can have the freedom to think creatively and explore different solutions. Well, this is precisely how we can integrate Lean Six Sigma DMake with those creative approaches. Any problem-solving method, including DMake, has a very clear separation between the problem and the solution space. In the problem space, we use more analytical technique, we follow a formal process to isolate the root causes, and in one way we converge until we understand the critical axis. When we then move to the solution space in the improve and control phase, well, the space now is open. We can diverge or broaden the space for creative solutions. And again, to do this, we can use elements of design thinking, the theory of inventive problem solving, the trees approach, and lateral thinking approaches. So, to close on this aspect, Lean Six Sigma does not stifle creativity. Instead, it seeks to provide a framework where innovation happens by design rather than by accident, and where improvement is by experiments rather than by the book. So we've come to the end of this video, and if you're still watching, all I can say is well done and thank you for your attention. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I do encourage you to get in touch if you want to share your experience and your views on experimental process improvement.